tonight is something a little bit different. I thought I would break the mold a little and read something a little bit different. So tonight we're reading some Mr. Men. I love Mr. Men. I think they're very funny and very well written, especially for children. But I think that every now and then the child in us actually quite likes us reading these as well. I know I do. And there's nothing wrong with that. So, let's read. Let's begin. Let's start with Mr. Clever. Mr. Clever was quite the cleverest person ever. The cleverest person in the world. And he knew it. "Oh, I am so very clever," he used to say to himself more often than not. He lived in Cleverland, where, as you may know, everybody and everything is as clever as can be. In Cleverland, trees managed to grow apples and oranges at the same time. In Cleverland, clever flowers get up and go for a walk. Clever worms drive around in cars all day. And clever elephants play tennis. Oh yes, Cleverland is quite the most clever place. Would you like to live there? Mr. Clever does. "Oh, I am so very, very clever to build such a clever house." He used to go around telling everybody. One morning, Mr. Clever was awakened by his special Mr. Clever alarm clock. Not only did it wake up by ringing a bell, it also switched on a light and said, "Good morning," and made a cup of tea, and showed what the weather was going to be, and told you the time, and showed you the date. It also whistled cheerfully while it was doing all that. Mr. Clever yawned, got up, washed, cleaned his teeth with his special Mr. Clever toothbrush, which squeezed toothpaste onto the brush out of the handle, and went downstairs for breakfast. He popped a slice of bread into his special Mr. Clever electric toaster, which not only toasted the bread, but also spread it with butter and marmalade, and cut off the crusts. After breakfast, he went for a long walk. An extremely long walk. In fact, such a long walk that he walked all the way out of Cleverland, although he didn't know it. He met somebody who was also out for a walk. Do you know who it was? That's right, Mr. Happy. cleverest person in the world. Oh, good, said Mr. Happy. Then you must be clever enough to make up a really good joke to tell me. He laughed. Jokes make me happy, he explained. Mr. Clever's face fell. I don't know any jokes, he admitted. Well, that's not very clever of you, is it? Said Mr. Happy, and went off. Mr. Clever went on. And do you know who he met next? That's right, Mr. Greedy. Hello, cried Mr. Clever. I'm the cleverest person in the world. Oh, good, said Mr. Greedy. Then you can tell me the recipe of the world's most delicious dish. He licked his lips. I like food, he explained. Mr. Clever's face fell. I can't cook, he admitted, and I don't know any recipes. Well, that's not very clever of you, is it? Said Mr. Greedy, and went off. In search of food. Mr. Clever went on. And do you know? And who do you think he met next? Yes, Mr. Forgetful. Hello, cried Mr. Clever. I'm the cleverest person in the world. Oh, good, said Mr. Forgetful. Then you can tell me what my name is. He smiled apologetically. I've forgotten, he explained. Mr. Clever's face fell for the third time that morning. But I don't know your name, he admitted. We've only just met. Well, that's not very clever of you, is it? Said Mr. Forgetful. He too went off, forgetting to say goodbye. And so it went on, all day. Mr. Clever couldn't tell Mr. Sneeze the cure for a cold, and he couldn't tell Mr. Small how he could grow bigger, and he couldn't tell Mr. Jelly what the secret of being brave was, and he couldn't tell Mr. Topsy-Turvy how to talk the right way round. The right way round. A not very clever day. Not at all. Not a bit. As by now, he wasn't feeling anything like the cleverest person in the world, Mr. Clever decided he'd better go home. He passed a pair of worms who were having a chat. Who was that? Asked one worm. That, replied the other worm, is Mr. Clever, the cleverest person in the world, on his way home to Cleverland. The first worm thought, he can't be that clever, he replied. He's going the wrong way. That was Mr. Clever. Let's next do Mr. Small. Mr. Small was very small, probably the smallest person you've ever seen in your whole life, or perhaps the smallest person you've never seen in your whole life, because he was so small you probably wouldn't see him anyway. Mr. Small was about as big as a pin, which isn't very big at all. So perhaps we should say that jobs. Mr. Small had thought about it for a long time, but he hadn't any ideas. Not one. He was thinking about it now. While he was having lunch, he was having half a pea, 1 crumb, and 1 drop of lemonade. Mr. Small thought and thought while he was eating his big lunch, but it was no use. Thinking just made him thirsty, so he had another drop of lemonade. I know, he thought to himself. After lunch, I'll go and see Mr. Robinson and ask his advice. So, after lunch, he left his house, walked up Mr. Robinson's house at the top of the garden. It was quite a long walk for somebody as small as Mr. Small, and halfway there, he stopped for a rest. He sat on a pebble, feeling quite out of breath. A worm crawled by and stopped. "Good afternoon, Mr. Small," said the worm. "Good afternoon, Walter," said Mr. Small to the worm, who knew quite well. "Out for a walk, are you?" asked Walter. "Going to see Mr. Robinson," replied Mr. Small. "Oh," said Walter. "About a job," added Mr. Small. "Oh," said Walter the worm again, and crawled off. Walter was a worm of very few words. After he'd rested for a while, Mr. Small set off again and walked all of the rest of the way to Mr. Robinson's house, without stopping once. When he got there, he climbed up to the steps to Mr. Robinson's back door. He knocked at the door. Nobody heard him. He knocked again at the door. Nobody heard him. The trouble was, you see, that if you're as small as Mr. Small, you don't have a very loud knock. Mr. Small looked up. There, high above his head, was a doorbell. "How can I ring the doorbell when I can't reach it?" thought Mr. Small to himself. He started to climb up the wall, brick by brick, to reach the bell. He had climbed up 4 bricks when he made the mistake of looking down. "Oh dear," he said, and fell. Bang! "Ouch," said Mr. Small, rubbing his head. Just then Mr. Small heard footsteps. It was the postman. The postman came to the door, posted his letters, and was just about to leave when he heard a voice. "Hello," said the voice. The postman looked down. "Hello," he said to Mr. Small. "Who are you?" "I'm Mr. Small," said Mr. Small. "Will you ring the bell for me?" Mr. Robinson opened the door and looked out. "That's funny," he said. "I'm sure I heard somebody ring the bell." He was just about to shut the door when he heard a little voice. "Hello," said the voice. "Hello, Mr. Robinson." Mr. Robinson looked down and down can't see that," said Mr. Robinson, "but leave it to me." Mr. Robinson knew a lot of people. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a restaurant and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, putting mustard into mustard pots. But Mr. Small kept falling into the pots and getting covered in mustard, so he left that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a sweet shop and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, serving sweets. But Mr. Small kept falling into the sweet jars, so he left that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a place where they made matches and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, packing matches into boxes. But Mr. Small kept getting shut in the boxes with the matches, so he left that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked on a farm and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, sorting out the brown eggs from the white eggs. But Mr. Small kept getting trapped by the eggs, so he left that job. "What are we going to do with you?" Mr. Robinson asked Mr. Small one evening. "Don't know," said Mr. Small in a small voice. "I've got one more idea," said Mr. Robinson. "I know somebody who writes children's books. Perhaps you could work for him." So, the following day Mr. Robinson took Mr. Small to meet the man who wrote children's books. "Can I work for you?" Mr. Small asked the man. "Yes, you can," replied the man. "Pass me that pencil and tell me all about the jobs you've been doing. Then I'll write a book about it. I'll call it Mr. Small," he added. "But children won't want to read a book all about me," exclaimed Mr. Small. "Yes, they will," replied the man. "They'll like it very much." And you did, didn't you? So I know that was quite small, and I only read 2 books out of the list, but I'd be interested to see what your reaction is to that. Whether you want more books like this, or perhaps not. What's your reaction? But either way, I hope it relaxed you. Well, I'm the ASMR bookworm. I hope it relaxed you